Welcome to the 10X Game Changer podcast with Rishon Blumberg and Michael Solomon, authors of the new book, Game Changer, How to Be 10X in the Talent Economy. 10X Talent brings at least 10 times the value to your organization. In this podcast, you'll hear real-world stories about how companies can attract, retain, and manage these highly skilled individuals and how the talent themselves can find the most fulfillment. Whether you're the talent, manager, or both, you're in the right place to start experiencing the rewards of becoming 10X.
Hi, I'm Rishon Blumberg, and welcome to 10X Game Changer podcast. Myself and my partner, Michael Solomon, who will introduce himself in a moment, have written a book called Game Changer, How to Be 10X in the Talent Economy. And we are running some episodes talking to some people that we've interviewed in the book about some of the topics that we talk about in the book and some topics that we don't talk about in the book. So without further ado, Michael, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Michael Solomon. I am Rishon's partner in 10X Management and in Brick Wall Management. I'm also co-founder of Musicians on Call and a couple of other nonprofit endeavors as well. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk with Jonathon and cover a few of the topics in our book and a few of the topics that have happened since we finished writing the book, which are pretty global and significant and I think changed the landscape, though for the most part, they make the book even more relevant than it was before. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jonathon Lowenhar, who is the founder of Enjoy the Work, which is an advisory firm, and Jonathon is personally our advisor and very trusted in that role. And he's going to tell us a little bit more about the company and the philosophy, and then we'll get into some more detail.
Thanks, guys. Briefly, I founded Enjoy the Work 5 years ago with a really simple premise. Who teaches the founder of a young company how to build a company? Generally speaking, what I found across my career is when someone started something new, they had mastery about something specific, their domain, their technology, what they're trying to bring into the world. But how to build an organization around that goes from zero to something and then from something to stable, that didn't really exist. Schools do this poorly, accelerators even worse. The cottage industry of coaches are more therapists than they are business strategists. I spent 2 years interviewing founders of young businesses all around the world until I came to a conclusion that something else was needed. So it's now been 5 years. We have several dozen companies where we work with the founders of those companies intimately. I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that very work with Rish and Michael on this call, and was excited to be able to participate in some small way in the creation of this book as well as this podcast.
Cool, that's great. By the way, in case you hear me referred to as Rish, some people do call me Rish. You out in podcast land, you can call me Rish too if you'd like. So diving into some of the questions that relate to the book, one of the chapters that we feature you in prominently is about this concept of success and sabotage, which is basically sort of the management continuum for an individual. You know, the concept is very simple, that people are sort of born with this natural predisposition towards one end or the other of that spectrum. The sabotage being people who sort of just make the wrong decisions fairly consistently, and that causes a lot of problems. And then the opposite is people who make pretty good decisions, well-informed decisions consistently, and that sort of raises all boats. And one of the things you talk about in the book that I think we should cover here that's really interesting is the ways that you spot sort of the sabotage instinct and unmanageability when you're talking with founders. Can you sort of expound on that a little bit?
Sure. There are folks that are trust-seeking, and there are those that are trust-avoiding. And if you ask a few questions and you get to know someone a little bit, it shows up really quickly.
Which are we? You don't have to say.
I'd like to say that you guys have both evolved. There's a pretty clear pattern for me of when you get to know someone, are they comfortable with vulnerability? Do they share about themselves and what's working in their business openly? Or are they quickly defensive? Do they hold themselves accountable? And when something has gone sideways in their professional life or their personal life, is there curiosity about their role in that? Or is it one story after another about how the world was against them? The folks that sabotage are the ones that don't want to play in that conversation. They don't want to play in that uncomfortable, awkward middle ground of, oh, wow, that went really badly. What was my part in that? My company's not achieving what it should. What is my part in that? We call them the folks with the yeah buts, where they might engage with you in the intellectual debate, but every time you offer a question or a curiosity, their response starts with, yeah, but those kind of indicators for us suggest someone with sabotage instincts. Your question about would I work with them, do we work with them, et cetera, it really comes down to a little bit of chemistry. Will they notice that about themselves, that tendency for that to happen in the conversation? And then even play in that conversation, play in the conversation of, oh, shit, that's what I'm doing. Or will they not even see it? Will the wall come down so hard that they won't even see it? And if it's in that second category, I can have respect for them. I can have an affection for them. I might even stay in touch with them. I will not work with them.
So a follow-up question to the success sabotage. When you're talking to a founder, if they have somebody on their team that they're describing as sort of being on the more sabotage side of the spectrum, are there any specific steps that you suggest that they follow? Our premise is you want to sort of get people who are prone to the sabotage instinct sort of out of your organization as soon as you can. Maybe there's some tips that you give to your startup founders that might be helpful here.
Yeah, there's the really explicit one that I've used successfully now for more than a decade, because I want to show up in these conversations with curiosity, not judgment. And especially if it's a member of the team, there's a lot that could be going on there. And it depends on your level of knowledge and intimacy with that particular employee. But I call it the tale of two letters, as taught to me by a colleague of mine who was my head of people, and his full name is Professor Tom Cody. And he was one of the first hires I made with a company that I helped run in 2005, which was a turnaround, a company that had a really broken culture. And we had this particular employee. I remember him, Robert. I remember Robert very, very clearly. And Robert was someone of great skill and shitty attitude. And so his ability for competence, excellence was really high. But the way he'd show up in terms of a team member as a supportive colleague was all over the board. And we were frustrated about, like, how do we get the best of him and minimize the worst from him? And Tom suggested, you know what, let's use the 2-letter approach. I said, okay, never heard of it. It's been 15 years. I used it ever since. I said, we're going to have 2 conversations with Richard. And this is an extreme, but we wanted to have it. So we're going to have 2 conversations. He's going to walk into a room and there are going to be 2 letters in front of him. And letter number 1 says, here's my job description and here's how I would gloriously fulfill it. And I will meet my obligations and I will show up the best version of myself and I will be present and I will be on time and I will smile and I will try and be collaborative and I'll try and be curious and open. And by the way, here's the functional description of what I'm also in charge of. And the second letter says I resign. Read them both, sign 1. It's an extreme interpretation of this idea of a conversation that you can have with an employee that says, this is a slightly more empathetic version. There are 2 versions of you I get to interact with all the time. Michael, I'll pretend it's you. There are 2 versions of Michael I get to chat with all the time. And version 1 is so much fun to work with. And you are open and you are bright and you are collaborative and you are curious and you get your stuff done and you're reliable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's really nice.
And then every once in a while, there's this other version of you. And when that one shows up, well, frankly, you're difficult or you're harsh or you're sarcastic or you're passive aggressive. And these things show up that, like, it's hard. So Michael, my question for you is, how do I get all of the first guy? And what can I do to support you to not have to ever work with the second guy ever again?
Well, the second guy is really your fault.
Nice. That's another podcast.
That was great. So I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic. In our book, you introduced several new terms that we had never heard before, as you just done in the last few minutes as well. One of the really fun and interesting ones is religious ostrich syndrome.
It's my sister's.
Let's just start with that.
Yeah. So my sister, frustratingly, is both funnier and smarter than I am. And there's zero chance I'll actually share this podcast with her because I don't ever want her to hear me say that publicly. She came up with a phrase a long time ago, this notion of the religious ostrich. And that is the person who when faced with something they don't want to hear, they hide their head in the sand as an ostrich does, and then they start to pray, the religious ostrich. It is not a great way of tackling uncertainty. I meet that founder, sadly, too often, that in the face of real danger, they just disappear from it and just hope it goes away, which, by the way, never happens. It just never, ever happens.
You mean that it never goes away? Yeah.
It never goes away.
Yeah.
The second phrase I think you were going to go to was, are you going to ask about Glassjaw?
Yeah, that was the second one, but there's even a third one.
So Glassjaw is my favorite. This is the one I use all the time. Glassjaw comes from a boxing reference, now many decades old. And this idea of a boxer who has such a weak chin that they can't even take a single punch without hitting the canvas. I never want to work with someone where even the most balanced of feedback has them react with such extreme emotion that we can no longer have a practical conversation. I call that employee someone who suffers from Glassjaw. They can't take any feedback without an outsized, enormous emotional response. I have found that Glassjaw does not correlate with gender. It does not correlate with age. It does not correlate with race. It does not correlate with experience. There are folks who can take feedback and hold themselves accountable to that feedback, hear it, process it. And there are those who just start swinging at you or, frankly, run away.
Yeah, I mean, that seems very sabotage. That is one of the qualities of somebody with a sabotage instinct. So what do you tell a manager who's working with an employee like that? Is it really sort of like you need to dismiss this person, or are there strategies to change that, turn it around at all?
A third party is not going to change that. That kind of change, sorry to get a little hippie on you, but I've lived in California a long time. That change is only coming from within.
Yeah.
So the question is that person who suffers the Glassjaw willing to have a conversation, the meta conversation about, here's the pattern I see. By the way, probably not. They probably can't even engage in that discussion, sadly. But if they are, then it's, how do we get them tools if, as a manager, you want to invest that much in them? Because that is not an insignificant level of investment.
Yeah.
Time, dollars, frustration, the impact on the rest of the organization. It might be the best thing you could do for them is to actually fire them for the company, and in the most loving and elegant way possible, while also protecting yourself legally, to share with them why.
Yeah.
Because they might need to hit that version of bottom before they actually look in a mirror about, hey, these 3 relationships of mine have all ended in the same way. Hey, these 3 jobs have all ended in the same way. There's one common chalk outline to all 6 of them, and it's mine.
There's so much about what we get into in the book about being a 10Xer that is right on these points, which is people who are 10X or are really on their path to being 10X are always seeking feedback with curiosity and putting themselves and their willingness to hear it and act on it and evaluate it in front of everything else. And, as we talk about the sabotage impulse and we talk about Glassjaw and religious ostrich, they all point to avoidant behavior that prevents you from improving and prevents you from becoming the better or best self you can be. And that's why we advocate pretty strongly that if you find these really significant sabotage traits in somebody on your team, you probably have to move away from them. It's not an easy fix.
And a lot of people, their instinct is to try and solve that problem. Like, oh, they're difficult in this way, or they're not owning up to their own issues. I can change them. I can help with that process. And the reality is you really can't.
That's one of my flaws, is that I'm constantly trying to give somebody the benefit of the doubt and think that I can help them, I can affect them, I can save them, I can put them on a path to change. I mean, even in some ways, the idea of this book is something where we're sort of making the dividing line between those who can be on the path to improvement and those who can't until they find some bottom, as you said, that's really, really different from where they are. Because it sometimes takes that horrific moment or losing that job or losing that relationship when people do start to look inward.
Right. I think the concept here is like, we want this book to help people identify the flaws that they have in themselves. And it's also about giving managers at companies and people that work with talent sort of reinforcing what they probably already know, most of them, that if you come across somebody like this, you may want to head in the other direction, because not only will you not be able to help them, but they're going to do things to the rest of your team that are negative as well. So it's like giving you sort of the justification for moving on from somebody with those issues.
And anyone that's managed folks for a long time, as I know the two of you have experienced, that horrible feeling of like walking that slack line, that tightrope of, oh my God, I have this super high performing person that is a cultural mess.
Yeah.
That I can't give feedback to, but the code they write is perfect.
Or the music that they play is phenomenal. Yeah.
That's right. Whatever role they play is they tactically excellent, but they are so emotionally young and brittle that they can't actually be a functioning member of a trusting team. And I see manager after manager try that terrible tap dance of, if I don't set them off, I can get the best out of them. My suggestion is run, just freaking run. Find the fastest, most elegant path possible to get them out the door.
We're in the era of 10X talent, where businesses large and small are only as good as their very best players. The exceptionally talented matter more than ever, and they know it. Is your company 10X ready? Take a quiz now to see how you measure up. Go to GameChangerTheBook.com or text GameChanger, one word, to 474747. Plus, get a preview of the new book, Game Changer: How to Be 10X in the Talent Economy by Michael Solomon and Rishon Blumberg. That's GameChangerTheBook.com or text Game Changer, one word, to 474747.
You know, I think that this is a good segue to talk about COVID and what's going on in the economy now. And this is stuff that, obviously we wrote the book before all this happened. Are there any specific things that you're talking to your founders about now versus before this happened, like sort of a peacetime versus wartime kind of concept? Is there anything different?
Hugely different. So Mark Andreessen wrote a post of peacetime versus wartime leadership, 2011, perhaps. It's succinct, it's smart. And we actually did a webinar recently internally for our community, and it's something that we train our CEOs on during these times of crisis, because for startups, times of crisis aren't always as a result of macroeconomic shocks.
Right.
Startups can go and businesses can go through crises all the time that requires a different form of leadership. And so we expanded upon the information that was shared in that original post to tactically convey to a founder, here's what is expected during wartime. And there are kind of three pillars to this, loosely speaking. One is wartime leadership decisioning has to be different. I'm not talking about a year from now. The language we use, we want you to be super nearsighted. Like, take the glasses off. I don't want you looking out into the future. What gets you through the next 90 days? Number two, what are the decisions that you can make that no matter what, protect the revenue you expect to get? How do you avoid churn in the near term at all costs? Three, what is your team today capable of actually doing? So as you think about any actions that you might take in response, it has to start from the people you already have in place, because the notion of bringing on new talent, onboarding new talent, training new talent, all of that usually takes too long if you are in extreme times of war, if you're actually at a point of survival. And the last one, anything that you're going to try and do, it has to operate on the time horizon that you believe is relevant for your business. And we think of that as kind of in a 2x2 matrix of, for your company, do you have a short runway, not a lot of cash, or a long runway? Do you expect for what you do to have a short rebound? Does it snap back and it's kind of a V curve for your type of industry? Or is it a long rebound? So you can imagine any company with short runway and long rebound, man, climb into your turtle shell and just try and survive.
Yeah. I mean, that's really what I think is so challenging about what we're going through now is it's not like a recession where there are all these economic indicators. It's not like a war, literally wartime, where there could be a win or a loss or a surrender or a ceasefire. We don't really know. There is no real timetable here. And whatever the timetable is could be lumpy. Things could come back online in parts of the US earlier than others. And it could take a long time once COVID is sort of dealt with. It could take a long time for economic recovery. So I think that this is a really challenging time in general. And I think a lot of the lessons we talk about in our book are playing out in real time, especially remote work. This is kind of an aside, but it's a scary time for all of us. And.
So we now have the first example of someone snapping to their dark vision of the future. And I'm going to actually snap you back in terms of chief reality officer in this very moment, because what we're seeing is that companies have three reactions or three relationships to this crisis. They are either susceptible to it, like you're the travel industry and you're just screwed. You're resilient through it. You can actually be a healthy business regardless of what's happening in the outside world, or you can survive this reasonably. Or three, you actually are countercyclical and you can grow through this, as the very platform we're using right now is an indication of. And so what I'd be curious about, even for your business, Michael, some percentage of your clients are truly countercyclical and they're going to grow like crazy through this, and they probably want more of your service. And then how, as an organization, can you lean into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing that all over the place. But to Rashawn's point, not to jump to the dark side, there are so many sectors, some of which we have direct relationships to, because we do still have an entertainment company that is very reliant on people getting together in a room and enjoying music or enjoying other kinds of entertainment experiences. And everything I can surmise as I look into the future, and the data does change day to day and the opinions change. I mean, it was a month ago that the government and all of the predictors were saying worst case scenario is there's 1 million US deaths. I'm really glad that's not looking like the current worst case scenario. Sorry, that wasn't worst case scenario. That was best case scenario.
Yeah.
Worst case scenario was 3 million deaths. And then we have, as recently as a week ago, worst case scenario is 200,000 deaths. Now it's 60,000 deaths. I don't know where it's going to land, and it's all fluctuating and it's too hard to know. But there are certain industries for whom this is going to be catastrophic. And for some of the people in those industries, their ability to have sort of applied some of the flexible ideas that we get into in the book of being ready for remote work, being able to use contractors, and being more agile, and I don't mean that in a software development sense, I mean that in a macro sense, is really the determination of whether they may be able to survive the storm or not.
I completely agree. I think that there is a new way of working that is going to show up, and it's going to be one born of necessity. There is a consequence for any business that requires large groups of human contact, and they're going to be forced to change for a period of time and then irrevocably changed. I will tell you that last Wednesday night, I attended a dance party, and it was fantastic.
Tell me it's a Zoom dance party. Was it a Zoom dance party?
Of course it was a Zoom dance party.
But streamed over Twitch, the sound quality, Rishon, would have absolutely met your expectations. And people were happy and joyous and connecting and had fun. So there is no doubt a crushing impact this is having on the short term. And I also am excited for the incredible innovation that's going to show up as a result of legions of folks forced to find a new way to make a living. Look, there's a lot that's broken in this country, and it doesn't matter which side of the political aisle you are on, you're going to feel that way. But one thing that seems to cut across party lines is this is an idea that when something goes bad in the US, we don't individually curl up in fetal position and just say, I give up. So for the legions of freelancers and artists and creators that have just had their way of making a living just thrown off, which America do you believe in? The version where they just give up and are screwed and they take a $1,200 check and like, I'll make do? Or do they find a new way to actually make this work? All the evidence I've seen in my life is the latter. It's going to be an ugly process to get there, but we get there. I think there are more 10Xers out there than I think we give ourselves credit for.
That's part of the reason we're working on hunger problems right now, because I think the road to getting there is going to be very bumpy.
Yeah.
So I think as we talk about these radical changes that the virus has brought on, it really screws us up with the book, because something we got completely wrong is we made a prediction of this transition to much more remote working and much more flexible thing was going to happen. It had already been happening, but was going to really play out over the next 5 to 10 years. As it turns out,
5 to 10 weeks.
Right. With a little help from a very tiny microbe, we are now looking at having gotten that number really wrong, but the prediction about the trend really right. And instead of it being sort of like this trend lineup, it was this trend lineup. But we're pretty amazed at seeing how quickly and how many people are adapting to this, and not just for work. I mean, I go to a weekly meditation group on Wednesday mornings in the town where I live, and we went from having anywhere between 5 and 8 or 10 people on a given week to having minimum of 30 per week now. And it's all because it's happening, everything went 2-dimensional. It all used to be 3-dimensional, and now it's just flat.
It'll be 3-dimensional again within a year, and I don't mean in person.
Yeah.
This will catalyze VR as well for us.
That's going to be really interesting to see. I'm very curious about that. That's been a technology really looking for a use case for a long time, besides gaming. So one of the things that we really get into extensively in the book that's super important is that everybody needs management and supervision and help and guidance. And we put that in a million different vernaculars in the book. But what we're really getting at is no matter how high up you are on the food chain in your organization or your company, you still need to find somebody who can give you that outside point of view and give you the perspective about yourself that you need. And as somebody who's, at the top of your organization as a company, and as somebody who's, your whole company is around advising people at the top of their enterprises, who do you turn to and how do you get the guidance that you need?
Yeah, I'm a believer that the best athletes in the world still have coaches, that you need a third person to look at your form, to look at your game tape with. I've done the same thing. So I'm a privately held business without outside capital. So there is no, just like frankly your company as well, there is no obligation for me to bring in a third party to check my own performance. So I did. I had a colleague of mine that in a lot of ways was the inspiration for Enjoy the Work. When I'll tell you a brief story. When I did my first startup, I had run previous to that large, complicated businesses with thousands of employees and national offices. And suddenly it was me and 2 other people and a couple of dollars in seed funding and a prototype that had smoke coming out of the sides. This was a really different world for me. I didn't understand what it meant to get a startup from nothing to something. And everything felt so complicated, how to get some sort of momentum in this business. And after I'd been doing it for a little while, I ended up getting introduced to this gentleman who had actually done multiple startups. And he had this beautiful capacity when I would dump upon him what felt like infinitely sophisticated, complicated topics, where he could pull it apart like the world's easiest Rubik's Cube and then hand it back to me and say, think about 1, 2, 3. Go read this one post. We'll chat again next week. And it didn't matter the topic. It could be human capital things and fundraising things and product strategy things. Just pull it apart, hand it back to me. And I only had access to him maybe once a month, but each time was transformative. And so years later, after I'd run several companies, after I'd sold my first startup, after I'd helped scale another one, I'd always had that memory of him, and he'd become a good friend. And I said, what if I had access to someone like that every day in my first company? What if every CEO and founder had access to someone like that every day, every time they needed it, both to kind of address the things that were plaguing you, but to also ask the questions of what around the corner? So fast forward years later, Michael, to finally answer your question, I formed a board of directors for my own company. That same gentleman, his name is Dylan, became my first board member.
And what kind of things do you go to him with?
I try to embody chief reality officer. Here's what I know to be true. I separate from that. Here's my guesses about what's around the corner. And I allow him to probe wherever he wants, ask whatever questions he needs to, so that he can try and ferret out blind spots that either I'm operating with or unwittingly the company by extension is operating with. So as examples in the last year, we had an economic structure that we had run our business with for 4 years. I started to see some cracks in how that might not serve us in the next 4 years. I came to him with, here's what I think I'm seeing. And he dug into those with me. And then he went one step further and he dug into those with some of my colleagues in the business to try and see, is there something wrong here or not wrong here? Is there an opportunity for something better? A second example is I was having a lot of friction with one of my partners. And we're both very trained on how to have that conversation in a healthy way, me and my partner, and we were still hitting a wall. We still weren't hearing each other really well because just like I'm sure is true, Michael, with you and Rishon, when you guys fight about something, you're bringing 40 years of baggage to the conversation, which is amazing because you're only 41. But you're bringing amazing baggage to the conversation. You can't just hear the thing. It's all the stuff layered underneath it. And that was getting in the way of my colleague and I as well. And by bringing in a third party, he was able to kind of sift through what was real and what was bullshit to help us have a better conversation.
That's fantastic.
Well, this was really a wonderful conversation. Jonathon, thank you so much for being a part of this.
And for being part of our company.
Yeah, and thank you for giving us advice for the last 4 years. I don't know if we're your longest standing client, but we're certainly one of them. And we've really enjoyed this. And thank you out there in podcast land for spending the time with us. And we look forward to future podcasts. Talk to you soon.
You know if you're a 10Xer, but do you know if you're experiencing all the rewards and satisfaction that should come with it? Find out with the new book, Game Changer, How to Be 10X in the Talent Economy by Rishon Blumberg and Michael Solomon. Start reading now for free at GameChangerTheBook.com. That's GameChangerTheBook.com.